Al Che se le conoce fundamentalmente como hombre de acción, como soldado, como jefe, como militar, como guerrillero, como individuo ejemplar, individuo que era el primero en...
Fidel Castro was born on August 13, 1926, in the small town of Bern, in the eastern province of Holguin, Cuba. He was the third of 7 children born to Angel Castro y Arguez, a Spanish immigrant who had come to Cuba as a young man, and Lina Ruz Gonzalez, a Cuban woman who worked as a maid in the Castro household. Fidel's father was a successful sugar plantation owner who became one of the richest men in Cuba. He was known for his entrepreneurial spirit and his willingness to take risks, and he instilled these values in his children. Fidel's mother, on the other hand, was a quiet and religious woman who devoted herself to caring for her family. Fidel's childhood was marked by privilege and wealth, but also by a sense of rebellion against the status quo. He was a bright and curious child who excelled in school and showed an early interest in politics. He was particularly influenced by his father's liberal views and his concern for the welfare of the Cuban people. In 1945, Fidel began studying law at the University of Havana, where he became involved in student politics and began to develop a reputation as a firebrand orator. He was particularly outspoken against the regime of Cuban dictator Fulgencio Batista, who had seized power in a military coup in 1952. Fidel's political activities led to his involvement in a failed uprising against Batista in 1953, known as the Moncada Barracks attack. Fidel and his followers hoped to spark a popular revolution against Batista's regime, but the attack was quickly put down by government forces. Fidel was arrested, tried, and sentenced to 15 years in prison, but he was released in 1955 as part of a general amnesty. After his release from prison, Fidel went into exile in Mexico, where he began to plan a new revolutionary movement to overthrow Batista. It was during this time that he met Che Guevara, a young Argentinian doctor who would become one of his closest advisors and allies. Fidel's family background played a significant role in shaping his political views and his revolutionary ideology. His father's success as a sugar plantation owner gave him a deep understanding of the power dynamics of Cuban society, and his concern for the welfare of the Cuban people influenced his commitment to socialist policies. Fidel's mother's quiet religiosity also had an impact on his life, although in a more personal and private way. Fidel was deeply influenced by the Catholic social justice teachings he was exposed to in his youth, and he saw his revolutionary movement as a way to put those teachings into action. Overall, Fidel Castro's early life was marked by a deep sense of rebellion against the status quo, a commitment to social justice, and a belief in the power of revolutionary action to effect real change in Cuban society. These values would continue to shape his life and his political career for decades to come. Fidel Castro's rise to power began with his formation of the 26th of July movement, named for the date of his failed attack on the Moncada military barracks in Santiago de Cuba on July 26, 1953. Despite the failure of the attack, which resulted in many deaths and the imprisonment of Castro and other rebels, the event served as a catalyst for the revolutionary movement. After being released from prison in 1955 as part of a general amnesty, Castro went into exile in Mexico, where he formed a guerrilla army with other exiles and supporters of his cause. In 1956, Castro and a small group of rebels, including his brother Raul and the Argentine revolutionary Ernesto Che Guevara, sailed from Mexico to Cuba aboard the yacht Granma. The group landed in Cuba's Oriente province and began a guerrilla campaign against the government of Cuban dictator Fulgencio Batista. The early months of the campaign were difficult for the rebels, who were vastly outnumbered and outgunned by Batista's forces. Many of their early battles ended in defeat, and the group was forced to retreat to the Sierra Maestra mountains. However, the rebels were able to gain the support of many rural peasants who were dissatisfied with the Batista government's corruption and repression. As the rebels' popular support grew, so too did their military strength, thanks in part to the arrival of new recruits and supplies from abroad. In 1958, the 26th of July movement launched a series of successful attacks on Batista's forces, culminating in the Battle of Santa Clara in December of that year. With the fall of Santa Clara, Batista's forces began to crumble, and he fled Cuba on January 1, 1959. The victorious rebels marched into Havana the following day, greeted by jubilant crowds of supporters. Castro quickly established a socialist government, nationalizing key industries and instituting land reform measures. He also implemented a program of social welfare policies, including the establishment of free education and healthcare. However, Castro's government soon faced challenges from opposition groups, particularly from those who opposed his close alignment with the Soviet Union during the Cold War. Despite these challenges, Castro remained in power for over 5 decades, outlasting numerous attempts to overthrow his government and weathering economic sanctions and political isolation from the United States and other countries. His rise to power, from his early political activism to the successful overthrow of Batista's regime, remains a pivotal moment in Cuban history and a testament to the power of popular resistance and revolution. The Cuban Revolution, led by Fidel Castro, was a period of intense political upheaval and social transformation in Cuba that began in the 1950s and culminated in the overthrow of the authoritarian Batista regime on January 1, 1959. The revolution was characterized by a combination of guerrilla warfare, political organizing, and popular mobilization, as well as an ideological commitment to socialist ideals and anti-imperialism. The origins of the Cuban Revolution can be traced back to the early 20th century, when Cuba was under the control of the United States and ruled by a series of corrupt and repressive governments. Fidel Castro, who was born into a wealthy Cuban family in 1926, became politically active as a young man and was deeply influenced by the ideas of Marxism and anti-colonialism. In 1952, Batista seized power in a coup and established a brutal dictatorship that was supported by the United States. This sparked widespread opposition from Cuban citizens, including Castro and his supporters. In 1953, Castro and a group of rebels launched an attack on the Moncada barracks in Santiago de Cuba, but the rebellion failed and Castro was captured and imprisoned. During his imprisonment, Castro wrote his famous "History Will Absolve Me" speech, which outlined his vision for a free and democratic Cuba. After being released from prison in 1955, Castro went into exile in Mexico, where he met Che Guevara and other revolutionary leaders. Together, they formed the 26th of July movement and began organizing a guerrilla army to overthrow the Batista regime. In December 1956, Castro and a small group of rebels landed on the shores of Cuba and began waging a guerrilla war in the Sierra Maestra mountains. The guerrilla movement gained support from a wide range of Cuban citizens, including peasants, workers, and intellectuals. The rebels' message of social justice, anti-imperialism, and national sovereignty resonated with many Cubans who were tired of the corrupt and repressive Batista regime. Over the next few years, the rebels engaged in a series of battles and ambushes, gradually gaining control over large parts of the island. In January 1959, Batista fled Cuba and Castro's forces marched triumphantly into Havana, signaling the end of the revolution. The new government, led by Castro, immediately began implementing a series of sweeping social and economic reforms, including the nationalization of industry and land reform. The government also established a system of universal healthcare and education, which helped to improve the lives of many Cubans. However, the new government also faced opposition from various groups, including former Batista supporters, exiled Cubans in the United States, and the United States government itself. The United States imposed a trade embargo on Cuba in an attempt to isolate the island and force regime change. The United States also supported various armed groups that attempted to overthrow the Cuban government, including the failed Bay of Pigs invasion in 1961. Throughout the 1960s and 1970s, Cuba aligned itself with the Soviet Union and became a key player in the Cold War. The Cuban government provided support for revolutionary movements in other countries, particularly in Latin America and Africa. However, the government also faced criticism from human rights groups and political dissidents who accused the regime of political repression and human rights abuses. Today, the legacy of the Cuban Revolution remains a subject of intense debate and controversy. Supporters of the revolution point to the social and economic gains made by the Cuban people, including the establishment of a world-class healthcare and education system. Critics of the revolution point to the lack of political freedom and the government's poor human rights record. Despite these ongoing debates, the Cuban Revolution remains one of the most significant political and social. The foreign policy and relations of the Cuban government under Fidel Castro were defined by a commitment to anti-imperialism, anti-capitalism, and international solidarity with other revolutionary movements around the world. This stance led to confrontations with the United States, which saw Cuba as a threat to its strategic interests in the Caribbean and Latin America. During the Cold War, Cuba aligned itself with the Soviet Union and became one of the Soviet Union's closest allies in the Western Hemisphere. This alignment began in the early 1960s, after the United States imposed a trade embargo on Cuba, and the Cuban government turned to the Soviet Union for economic and military support. The alliance with the Soviet Union had a profound impact on Cuban foreign policy. The Cuban government became involved in revolutionary movements around the world, providing support to left-wing governments and groups in Africa, Asia, and Latin America. This support often took the form of military aid, technical assistance, and political training. One of the most significant examples of Cuba's support for revolutionary movements was its involvement in the Angolan Civil War. In the late 1970s, Cuba sent tens of thousands of troops to Angola to support the socialist government against a right-wing insurgency backed by the United States and South Africa. The Cuban intervention was successful, and the socialist government was able to maintain power with Cuban assistance. Cuba's alignment with the Soviet Union also led to a series of confrontations with the United States. In 1961, the United States backed an armed invasion of Cuba by exiled Cubans, known as the Bay of Pigs invasion. The invasion was a failure, and its strength and the Cuban government's resolve to resist U.S. imperialism. In 1962, the Cuban Missile Crisis brought the world to the brink of nuclear war. The crisis began when the Soviet Union installed nuclear missiles in Cuba, prompting a U.S. naval blockade of the island. After several tense days of negotiations, the Soviet Union agreed to remove the missiles in exchange for a U.S. pledge not to invade Cuba and a secret U.S. promise to remove nuclear missiles from Turkey. Throughout the 1970s and 1980s, Cuba continued to support revolutionary movements around the world, often at great cost to its own economy and security. In the 1980s, Cuba sent troops to fight in the civil wars in Nicaragua and El Salvador, providing crucial support to left-wing governments and insurgent groups. After the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991, Cuba faced a period of economic hardship and isolation. The loss of Soviet aid and the continued U.S. embargo left the Cuban economy in shambles, and the government was forced to implement a series of market-oriented reforms to try to revive the economy. Despite the challenges facing the Cuban government, Cuba continued to pursue an independent foreign policy and to support left-wing governments and movements around the world. Today, Cuba remains a symbol of anti-imperialism and socialist solidarity, even as it faces ongoing challenges both at home and abroad. Fidel Castro's domestic policies and controversies were defined by his commitment to socialist ideals and his desire to create a more equal and just society in Cuba. However, his implementation of these policies was often criticized for its authoritarianism, political repression, and human rights abuses. One of the central pillars of Castro's domestic policies was the nationalization of industry and the establishment of a state-controlled economy. After the revolution, the Cuban government expropriated the property of foreign businesses and wealthy landowners, bringing key industries under state control. This policy was intended to redistribute wealth and power to the Cuban people and to promote economic development. The nationalization of industry was accompanied by a series of land reforms, which redistributed land from wealthy landowners to poor farmers and agricultural workers. This policy was also intended to promote greater economic equality and to improve the living standards of rural Cubans. However, the nationalization of industry and the establishment of a state-controlled economy had a number of negative consequences. The Cuban economy became heavily reliant on Soviet aid, and the government's control over key industries and resources led to inefficiencies and corruption. Cuba's economy also became heavily dependent on the export of sugar and other agricultural products, leaving the country vulnerable to fluctuations in international commodity prices. Another controversial aspect of Castro's domestic policies was his suppression of political opposition and his censorship of the media. The Cuban government has long been criticized for its strict control over the press and its use of censorship to silence critics of the government. The Cuban government has also been accused of a range of human rights abuses, including the use of arbitrary detention, torture, and extrajudicial killings to suppress dissent. Human rights groups have documented a number of cases of political prisoners and dissidents being held in inhumane conditions and subjected to torture and other forms of abuse. In addition to political repression, Castro's government has also been criticized for its treatment of minority groups, particularly the LGBT community. Homosexuality was considered a crime in Cuba until the 1970s, and LGBT people were subjected to harassment and discrimination by the government. Despite these controversies, Castro's government was able to achieve significant social and economic gains for the Cuban people. The government's investment in education and healthcare led to significant improvements in these areas, and Cuba became known for its high levels of literacy and its universal healthcare system. Today, Cuba remains a divided society, with some Cubans continuing to support the government's socialist policies and others calling for greater political freedoms and economic liberalization. The government has recently implemented a series of market-oriented reforms to try to revive the Cuban economy, but it remains to be seen whether these reforms will be sufficient to address the country's ongoing challenges. In his later years, Fidel Castro's influence on Cuban politics and society continued to be significant, even after he formally retired from power and transferred leadership to his brother Raúl Castro. Following his retirement, Fidel remained a powerful figure in Cuban politics and continued to be involved in key policy decisions. He also remained a popular and respected figure among many Cubans, who saw him as a symbol of resistance against American imperialism and as a champion of social justice and equality. Despite his retirement, Fidel continued to be a vocal critic of the United States and its policies towards Cuba. He condemned the American economic embargo on Cuba and accused the United States of pursuing a hostile an aggressive policy towards the island nation. He also continued to support revolutionary movements in other countries, particularly in Latin America and Africa. Fidel's legacy on the Cuban economy and society is complex. While his policies contributed to significant gains in healthcare and education, they also led to economic inefficiencies and dependence on Soviet aid. Cuba's economy remained stagnant and heavily centralized, with limited opportunities for entrepreneurship and innovation. Under Raúl Castro's leadership, the Cuban government has implemented a series of market-oriented reforms aimed at reviving the economy and increasing economic opportunities for Cuban citizens. These reforms have included the expansion of private enterprise, the legalization of small businesses, and the opening up of the Cuban economy to foreign investment. However, the government has also faced ongoing criticism for its suppression of political opposition and its restriction of civil liberties, including freedom of speech and assembly. Human rights groups continue to document cases of political prisoners and dissidents being held in inhumane conditions, and there is ongoing debate over the extent to which political and civil rights have improved in Cuba in recent years. Despite these ongoing challenges, Fidel Castro's legacy continues to shape Cuban politics and society. He is remembered as a revolutionary leader who fought for the rights of the Cuban people and who challenged American imperialism in Latin America and beyond. At the same time, his legacy is also marked by controversy and criticism, particularly with regard to his government's human rights record and its suppression of political opposition. In conclusion, Fidel Castro was a complex and controversial figure whose life and legacy continue to be debated and discussed to this day. Through his opposition to the Cuban dictator Fulgencio Batista and the establishment of a socialist government in Cuba, he became an important historical figure whose policies and ideas had a profound impact on the country and the world. Castro's policies, such as land reform, nationalization of industries and businesses, and healthcare and education reforms, were intended to create a more equal and just society in Cuba. While his efforts brought about some successes, such as the elimination of illiteracy and the establishment of a comprehensive healthcare system, they were also criticized for their limitations and failures. Castro's international influence was also significant, as he supported socialist and communist movements abroad and aligned Cuba with the Soviet Union during the Cold War. This brought Cuba to the forefront of global politics and made it a key player in the international socialist movement. However, Castro's legacy is also marked by controversies and criticisms, including human rights violations, political repression, and economic difficulties in Cuba. His suppression of political dissent and execution of political opponents are among the most troubling aspects of his rule. Despite the challenges and criticisms, Fidel Castro's life and legacy offer important lessons and insights for us today. By reflecting on his story, we can better understand the complexities of socialism, revolutionary politics, and the role of leadership in creating lasting change. We encourage you to continue learning more about Fidel Castro, Cuba, and the history of socialism, and to reflect on the relevance of these issues for our own time. Thank you for watching.